Everyone, so welcome to week 8 and chapter 8 of this semester. So we're almost a little bit over halfway of the semester, which is kind of exciting and maybe a little bit scary since everything feels a little bit rushed towards the end, but we will get there. So this week we're going to be covering communication, and as the book talks about language and emotion. I choose to call it communication though because I really think that the way that we talk about emotion is usually how we communicate it, and also obviously language is developed as a way to communicate with each other. The study of linguistics has been around for many, many years and centuries, and it's been more recently, though, that it was kind of explored as how does language influence gender or vice versa. And one of the theories or hypotheses that kind of try to understand how language and gender relate is a Warfine hypothesis. So basically, this is kind of an all-encompassing theory that kind of proposed that language or communication basically determines the nature of the speaker's thoughts. So that we have our thoughts and our worldviews, and that language or communication basically just is kind of a window of that. So coupled with how gendered our language has been, kind of tells us where we're at. So the generic masculine is our tendency in English, at least, to usually use male gendered terms when we're talking about mixed-sexed groups. So for example, often I will relate to my students as you guys, and of course not everyone would classify as a guy, but we never really say you gals. I highly doubt that any of your professors has come and said, hey, gals. And if you kind of think about it, it's practically the same difference if it didn't matter, right? But it does because nobody uses the latter. The same thing goes for terms that we use, such as policeman, congressman, fireman, mankind. You know, we don't really say womankind and assume that it encompasses everyone, but we do use the word mankind, policemen, and congressmen. To the naked eye, this might seem as though it doesn't have an impact on our world in general, but there are some research that kind of says otherwise. So just to give you an example of how language is important, let's take, for example, the term sexual assault. We will have a chapter which encompasses gender violence. There will be some sections on there on sexual assaults and sexual crimes. Now, the term sexual assault is actually a pretty relatively newer term. So before, about 15, 20 years ago, we didn't really use this as much. We would use the term rape, harassment, groping, words that are around the kind of realm. But nowadays, we usually use the word sexual assault to encompass a lot of things. When I say the word sexual assault, again, we might have reactions, hopefully not a lot of experiences with that, but it does provoke this reaction from people. If we were to use, for example, instead the word rape, that can have a really negative connotation versus sexual assault. So actually, when we look at the history of sexual assault, it was actually promoted by defense attorneys of defendees during trial. If left unexamined, we could think that maybe language does not have an impact. Just knowing that it was sort of used as a tactic for policymakers and for defense attorneys to sort of decrease the emotional reaction from certain terminology than sexual assault. Not only do the different words impact our reaction and our kind of perceptions of it, but it also is said that it also impacts how we behave or how we perceive others. So for example, people are given terms or stories, or let's say like juries are given the story of how something happened. When a situation, or let's say the timeline, is read in a passive voice, so basically saying, well, Miss whatever or Mr. whatever noted that they were assaulted during X, Y, and Z, there is less perception of harm to victims and more responsibility of victims and less responsibility in perpetrators. There's various studies in the criminal justice system and the cross between that and psychology that have looked at this, of how information is passed on and what type of terminology and how, whether it's passive or active voice, how those accounts and the way that they're presented really impact all these different perceptions. Therefore, it is definitely very important that we study and understand the impact of language and communication, as it does have real life implications. When wanting to really look at some of the differences in gender, or I guess here I have sex, but in gender, of how people interact, usually watching children is probably one of the easiest ways, because you can kind of see these differences since a very young age. And again, here I have sex, but really when we're talking about this, we're talking about more from a gender perspective, as most of these kids have been gendered in whatever the culture they're coming from. So some clear differences is definitely you have more boys in this case play larger groups, dominance, competitive, loud. They tend to be more outside. Pretend play is a little bit more action-oriented. Even I have nieces and nephews, and when they're playing cars, I've already seen them play cars very almost aggressively, which is kind of funny because there's really nothing aggressive about cars, I guess, in a sense. And for girls, they tend to be more quiet, cooperative, indoors. Pretend play is more related to kind of real world roles, quote unquote, and use more kind of pro-social dominance. So they might maybe say, well, let's all build a house kind of thing, versus boys tend to have more of an egotistical dominance, which might look like more like let's race to the next spot and see who gets there first. So I have about 5 little nieces and nephews. It's kind of cute to watch them play because they're all under the age of 4. And there's 2 girls and 3 boys, and it's interesting to see how they interact with each other and how their different personalities come up. But usually when we start to see more gendered play, that is like seeing differences, is usually around the age of 3. Now again, this is going to be different depending on the kid. For example, my little nephew, when he was, I think, around 2, he told me that he couldn't give me any of his, I think he had cookies or something because I was a girl, So obviously his notation of the gender differences was a little younger. Same-sex play, this is another thing that is kind of a developmental milestone. This occurs, again, usually around the age of 3 to 4. It's going to depend on the child. And often you see the girls first kind of convene and do their own little girl play before the boys. Now, at face value, that might mean nothing, but what it really means is more so that what we consider boy play is usually things that are a little bit more active, more outside, more like related to sports. And that's not something that a 3-year-old can do. 3-year-olds don't really go around being very athletic because they don't have the coordination yet. They also can't really go outside and play by themselves because they need the supervision, versus what we consider girl play tends to be things that are more indoor, more safe, more artistic, more let's play house. So it's more about the availability of the type of play than anything else. If we were to see this opposite, we probably wouldn't see this difference in the age group. A couple things that have come out, though, is that we continue to observe that in our culture, which again is very gendered, is that there are some different play styles, as I mentioned before, the egotistical versus pro-social, girls tending to kind of demonstrate more pro-social types of play. At that young age, usually it's very difficult for girls to influence boys, and that comes from a little bit of older research, which I'm not going to go into. There's a couple of YouTube videos that talks about, it's a show called The Secret Life of 5-Year-Olds, and you can totally see all the gendered stuff in there. Institutional support basically saying that a lot of these differences and the kind of the split of the same-sex play is also really just encouraged by people, by older adults who find it cute when girls start to play house or cooking, or when they start to be interested in the makeup. And the same goes with boys, where they might encourage, the racing, the climbing the tree kind of thing. The segregation cycle kind of explains how that's happened. So first, there's kind of around the age of 3 or 4 is when kids start to have more stereotypical thinking. So they think, mom's cook and dad's the mower or something like that. Again, especially if that's true for their household. There might it's not quite as true for everybody, as maybe there's parents out there who don't have those school roles. Then from there, they actually first start with reducing their self-efficacy of interacting with the other sex. So in this case, you would have girls maybe not necessarily thinking that they could go outside and rough play with the other boys, and then they spend more time with their same-sex peers, which again leads to less positive attitudes to other sex and more negative attitudes towards the other sex in general. So all this kind of spirals into more and more segregated play. Definitely has its peak around middle school, a little bit before middle school. Then once people go into high school, some of these gender differences kind of disappear. Well, again, adult interactions are very important into how kids are socialized and what kind of communication they use in terms of language or the emotion that they're showing. However, have expectations already of how people, quote unquote, should be interacting. So for women, we usually kind of believe that they should have positive social behavior. So their behaviors tend to be more caregiving, more with a role of othering, supporting, bringing people together. Where males are more focused on task behavior, so less with people and more about accomplishing certain things, such as finishing a job, building something, cutting the grass. He just left this as it is, and then we would assume then that the men of the house would just be the cleaners, right? Because that's a task. Cleaning the bathroom, vacuuming, everything is a task. But usually, this is where I kind of do a raise of hands of how many people's fathers do this role, and usually most people kind of say they don't. So their mom does more of that. So again, it's not necessarily task behavior, but it's which type of task that is important. And that is one of very basic example of a moderating factor, that you can't really just say this or that, A or B, because there's so many other factors that influence, such as, again, the task. Which brings us to the moderators. So when we think, first one, again, the nature of the task. So females, again, will still focus on more feminine tasks. And what we consider a feminine task is going to be based definitely on the society. Certain societies that were a lot more androgynous, such as the Polynesian cultures, they actually did not have too much of a gender role difference. So if we were to ask them what feminine, masculine tasks, that might not be as an easy thing to do than in the US, where we clearly do have feminine tasks, masculine tasks. So now if you think about what your family has done to hurricane and evac for possible storms, you kind of see this around. I have prepped already for 2 different hurricanes, and definitely you could see this kind of into play. And again, not necessarily clear cut. Obviously there was plenty of women and men sometimes working together to board up the houses, plenty of men in the grocery stores trying to get food, and then when we were trying to get the sandbags, that was also both, but you would still see more men, just as you would see a little bit more women in the grocery store. The sex composition of the group is another factor that influences the behavior. So in this case, when you have more of a same-sex group, so it's all men or all women, you will definitely see the most sex differences. So it's almost like you kind of start to multiply this and they just exponentially grow. For example, women who traditionally are expected to be pro-social will even get even more pro-social if they're among women. They really, really start to help each other. Versus men, where they get together, there's almost this kind of alpha dog kind of complex that everybody starts to get, where they start to be even more and more kind of egotistical and more about the winning and accomplishment than binding together. Here's a classic example from Carly 89 that kind of looked at what the difference was in dyad. So if your partner was a male or female, and depending on what kind of task behavior, what would be the outcome? So in this case, what they did is they had people either have a male partner, so male, the person that they were looking at would be the male-female, and then they had a confederate, which was a male partner or female partner, and they looked at their task behavior or their pro-social behavior. And as you can see here, in the task behavior, with the male partner, everybody just helped a little bit more, including the females having a male partner. When there was a female partner, there was also just a little bit less for both, but you really didn't see too much of a difference. There's a greater difference when we're talking about positive social behavior. In this case, where it's 2 guys, so male partner, we're a male partner, that's actually the least helpful. So if you ever want to do something that has to do with a positive social behavior, such as, I don't know, giving people positive feedback, this might not be the best diet, unfortunately, in our current cultural situation. The most pro-social behavior was definitely the female-female partner. So again, that is where you're kind of expediting the group. And it's almost like this gendered expectation just gets multiplied by exponentially. So the other two moderators that I think are important to address are whether the interaction happens is brief and whether it's with strangers. So you actually see a lot more sex differences when this happens. When a person is a stranger or where it's very brief, we actually operate under the same kind of same-sex versus opposite sex kind of stereotypes. So for example, if you have two strangers who are women and they are going to briefly interact, they were also going to super help each other and become almost more feminine in a way because it's so brief. And the reason behind this is that, again, we use kind of our stereotypes. So our most obvious category in this case would be gender in order to guide how we're interacting. And the same thing would go for men, where they would be more, again, stereotypically male if that is the only way that they know this person. They just know that they're a guy, therefore I'm going to act in a very guy kind of way. So social media kind of, again, tells us a little bit about our gender differences. As you can see, women are still a little bit outnumbered in Facebook, and then you got Google. LinkedIn is an area that where it's pretty similar. I think, though, if we were to get data more recent, because I think this is probably from 2013, so I don't have anything newer, but if I did, I could assume that we could probably see a little bit of a shift here where you're having more men use LinkedIn than women. I will see if I can find that somewhere, though. Instagram, also, again, very female-oriented. Pinterest, very much so. So we all have stereotypes of what socializing looks like for the different sexes and genders. Usually it is said that, girls tend to talk a lot, to say all their feelings and do it very elaboratively. Men or boys will just respond in a couple very shortcut answers. And research actually kind of supports this. So when we look at kids, girls actually acquire language sooner than boys. We're not really sure why, but so it's said that females might be just better at decoding emotion, which again is such a big part to our communication, understanding, and even language. In terms of adult, though, definitely males talk more than females, and this gets even more so lopsided, favoring males when we look at who you're talking to, because often you have, again, a lot of women who might be staying home and they're talking to little kids. So it's probably, not that that doesn't count, obviously they're little humans too. But if we were to remove that and actually kind of just think about full-fledged adults, definitely males talk more. There are some moderators. For example, men tend to speak in longer periods, which is why sometimes if I ask people to guess who talks more, often women are kind of said to talk more, but we do talk more, but it's more times, but not more in general. So when we're measuring how much people are talking, we're talking about the time spent completely, not the amount of turns being taken. The sex of the interacting partner is huge too. So for example, men talk more with opposite sex than same-sex people. So they might be talking more to their coworkers who are other women and to their same-sex. So other guys, they might keep conversations very. Some special features that seem to be still prominent is that you see females being more effective, more elaborate, a lot more indirect. So saying things such as, I think that maybe this can work, versus a male would say, the plan is perfect as is, So there is definitely a different kind of flavor that is very gendered, where males tend to exude more individuality, dominant, a lot of more assertion, so being very assertive, focusing more on orders, versus women tend to focus more on consensus and relateness. So as I mentioned, girls tend to develop language a little bit faster than boys. They're also seen to actually talk just more to adults and their peers. So that is the other reason of why, again, their language development seems to be a little stronger, at least initially in the first years, because not only do they talk to their peers, but in general they do communicate more with their caregivers. Now remember, I teach this in an intersectional approach, so when we're talking about this, we also need to talk about the other factors, such as culture, race, context. In this case, there has been research that has tried to look at the implications or the differences of sex and race and the interaction of that. And what has been found is Susie, Summers and Embody 2012, what they did was that they basically had groups of students get together, and then they measured the time, they had them discuss a topic, and they measured the time that was spent talking. So talkativeness. So they measured each one of the participants, and then they would measure how long they were talking and keeping track of that. Well, what they found was that when the groups were all white, you could definitely see a difference in terms of sex. So where males would talk more than females. And they did this a couple times, so this isn't just the one time. However, when they were mixed, this difference between the sexes or gender, we'll just go with gender, was actually nullified. So there was not a difference in gender of who was talking. Now, secondly, what they also found, which is I think the most interesting aspect, was when you compared in an all-white group versus a mixed group, and in this case I think they only had African Americans as their other group, it wasn't that the men were actually talking any less. They were talking at the same rate in both the white group and the mixed group. So they were still getting in their talking points. What happened was that actually the women, specifically the white, were actually gaining some of the talk time when it was mixed than when it's a white. So you just had a lot more talking just overall. So nobody really kind of lost talking space. So it wasn't like the white men were talking less. It's just everybody else was talking more, so you had less silence. So this is a good example, again, of why it's important to do research and to really promote the idea of diversity, not just from a justice and equity perspective, but really it is better for everybody to have a place at the table. Now quickly I'm going to go over nonverbals. So nonverbals are another way that we communicate, and they kind of across the board, kind of easy to predict. So overall, females do smile more. Again, that's a social expectation to be kind and approachable and, happy, I suppose. There are some cross-cultural effects, and in cultures where it's not expected as much, you might not necessarily see females smiling at the same rates or even similar. I think some different Asian countries and groups might, again, promote more of kind of a seriousness to their conversation as a way of appearing wise, knowledgeable, so they might downplay some things such as smiling. In kids, there is no difference though. So this is another aspect that really tells us that this smiling or not smiling is really culturally based. When you see an effect of any kind of behavior, whether it's nonverbal, verbal, disappear in children, but then get very prominent in adulthood, usually that is what we consider the effect of socialization. Because again, kids are not socialized. It takes them years to be socialized into what they're expected to do. So therefore, it is really more so the culture and expectation that does that. I like to point out the study because I think it's very interesting. So, and here we have the differences in smiling young kids from kindergarten to high school. And as you can see, there's also tracking whether they're white or black. They call them African American versus European American, but for simplicity, we'll call it white and black. So for the white girls and boys and black girls and black boys, it's pretty similar across the board from kindergarten to about 4th grade. There's not too many differences, kind of goes up and down. Kindergarten's being very giddy, 1st grade is more serious. The biggest shift, though, really happens in middle school, so around 5th to 6th grade, where you definitely see a gender split with both boys that are white and black just smiling less, and girls still kind of staying constant to their grade school years. Now, I think the saddest part here is definitely seeing that African American boys or black boys are definitely among the groups that just reduce their smiling very substantially. When I think about this and think about all the social issues that are going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, and also the way that we know people are viewed stereotypically, specifically black males, I think this is kind of a good, and again, another lens into that kind of points out, again, that we're socializing kids a specific way, that something in society is telling certain groups to just not smile enough or to be tough, such as like the video that you guys saw with the tough guys. And finally, this is the last slide that I'm going to cover. So in terms of gaze is another aspect that is very communicative. And the thing is that this is one of the nonverbals that's very substantially different from some cultural groups versus the other. For example, as a therapist, as many of you know, I'm a counseling psychologist, so that was one of the first things that we talked about our tendency to either look at clients or look away. I'm more of a looker away kind of person, but it has to do a little bit with my cultural background and also just my therapeutic style. So I like to kind of be very Columbo and just ponder about questions, and I'm a little bit less directive versus some people that might have more of a cognitive behavioral approach are probably more directive, especially if they're more raised in Western kind of cultures. So there are differences in how or who sees each other, or what does it look like to be paying attention. For example, again, some cultures it's expected that when you're listening, you look directly at the person. In others, if you're listening, you're looking at the ground or away, and as a way to kind of give space to the speaker. So there are a lot of cultural variations that are, but in terms of gender, overall, you do see that there are more gazes, that females gaze more, so they look at people more. Again, data supports that even young infants tend to stare at faces a lot more, and that once they get into the toddler years, they're actually a lot better at decoding emotion than males. And similarly, if you have females decoding emotion, then they're probably going to be a lot better at conveying and sending. And this is also true once you get older into the kid years. The only aspect where males are a little bit better at is conveying and sending negative emotion. So it's a lot easier to tell if a male is upset, angry, negative in general when they're males. Women, again, get socialized not to do these things, so you tend to kind of repress those aspects a little bit more. Now, in aspects of touch, from preschool to high school years, there's a lot more same-sex touching. So they're more likely to hug or maybe bump your friend if they're another guy or another girl that is your same sex or gender than the opposite. Now, once you get into college and adulthood years, it actually becomes the opposite for men more so, where they are more likely to hug and to kind of touch or the opposite sex versus the same sex. And there is a difference between men and women. Women tend to touch both ways. Men tend to avoid same-sex touching. Again, probably related to some of the fear of the homophobia and some of those things that our culture unfortunately pushes. So that is it for today. Make sure to read all the chapters. There's plenty of other stuff that I did not cover that you are expected to know. This is just kind of a brief overview of the chapter.